The morning sun was just starting to peek over the rolling hills of Texas when Rebecca stepped out of her small wooden cabin. It was 1847, and life on the frontier wasn't easy for anyone, especially not for a woman living alone. Her husband had passed away 2 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but a small piece of land and the determination to survive. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the cool morning air hit her face. The water buckets by her door reminded her of the day's first task. The creek was about a 10-minute walk from her home, winding through the tall grass and scattered oak trees that dotted the landscape. She had made this trip hundreds of times before, always careful to stay alert. This was dangerous territory, where settlers and Native American tribes had an uneasy relationship at best. Rebecca picked up the wooden buckets and started walking toward Cedar Creek. The path was familiar, under her feet, worn down by her daily trips for water. She could hear the gentle sound of flowing water getting louder as she got closer. The creek was one of the few reliable water sources in the area, which made it precious to everyone who lived nearby. As she approached the bank, something felt different today. Usually the area around the creek was peaceful, with only the sounds of birds and the gentle flow of water. But today there was something else. She stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again, a sound that made her heart skip a beat. It was a voice, and it sounded desperate. Rebecca set down her buckets and moved carefully toward the sound. Her husband had always told her to be cautious, especially around the creek where the ground could be unstable. She pushed through some low-hanging branches and followed the curve of the creek downstream. The voice was getting louder now, and she could tell it was young, a child's voice. But the words weren't in English. As she got closer, she realized, with a shock, that it was a Native American boy, and he was in serious trouble. The scene in front of her was terrifying. A young boy, probably no more than 10 years old, was trapped in what looked like quicksand near a bend in the creek. The wet sand had grabbed him like hungry hands, and he was stuck up to his chest. Every time he tried to move, he seemed to sink a little deeper. About 20 feet away, a brown and white horse stood perfectly still, as if it understood the danger. The animal kept looking between the boy and the surrounding area, clearly distressed but unable to help. Rebecca's first instinct was fear. Relations between settlers and the local Comanche tribes were tense, sometimes violent. Many of her neighbors had warned her about encounters with Native Americans. Some had told her stories that kept her awake at night. But looking at this child, this terrified little boy who was fighting for his life, all those warnings seemed to disappear. The boy saw her and his eyes went wide. For a moment they just stared at each other across the dangerous ground. She could see the fear in his face, and she wondered if he was scared of drowning or scared of her. Maybe both. Time was running out. She could see that he was getting tired from struggling, and the quicksand seemed to be winning. If she was going to help, she had to act now. Rebecca looked around quickly, trying to figure out what to do. She had heard stories about quicksand from other settlers. The key was not to panic and not to struggle too much. But how could she get him out without getting trapped herself? She spotted a fallen tree branch about 6 feet long and reasonably sturdy. Moving carefully to avoid the soft ground, she picked it up and tested its strength. It would have to do. "Hold still," she called out, even though she knew he probably couldn't understand English. She used hand gestures, hoping he would get the message. "Don't move." The boy seemed to understand her tone, if not her words. He stopped struggling and watched her carefully as she positioned herself at the edge of the stable ground. Rebecca extended the branch toward him, staying as far back as she safely could. The boy looked at the branch, then at her face, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. After what felt like forever, he reached out and grabbed the end of the branch with both hands. "Good," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "Now hold tight." She began to pull, slowly and steadily. At first, nothing happened. The quicksand didn't want to give up its prize, but Rebecca didn't give up either. She adjusted her position, planting her feet firmly, and pulled. Again. Inch by inch, the boy began to move. The quicksand made wet, sucking sounds as it reluctantly released its grip. Rebecca's arms were starting to ache, but she kept pulling. The boy helped as much as he could, using the branch to pull himself up without thrashing around. It took nearly 10 minutes of careful, patient work, but finally, the boy was able to get one leg free, then the other. With a final effort, he pulled himself onto solid ground, covered in mud but very much alive. Both of them sat there for a moment, breathing hard. The boy was shaking, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion. Rebecca couldn't tell. Probably all three. She looked at him more closely now. He was small for his age, with long black hair and dark eyes that seemed much older than his years. His clothes were simple but well made, leather pants and a cloth shirt, both now covered in mud. Around his neck was a small leather pouch that had somehow stayed with him through the ordeal. The boy looked at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also confusion and maybe a little fear. He said something in his own language, words she couldn't understand but that sounded like thanks. Rebecca smiled and nodded, hoping he would understand that she was glad he was safe. She pointed to herself and said, "Rebecca." Then she pointed to him with a questioning look. The boy seemed to understand. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Kiu, though she wasn't sure if she was hearing it right. They sat there for another minute, two people from completely different worlds who had just shared something important. Then the boy stood up, still a bit shaky but determined. He walked over to his horse, which had been waiting patiently through the whole rescue. Before mounting his horse, the boy turned back to Rebecca. He placed his hand over his heart, then pointed to her. The message was clear, even without words. He would remember what she had done. Rebecca watched as he climbed onto his horse with the easy skill of someone who had been riding since he could walk. He looked at her one more time, nodded slightly, then turned his horse toward the horizon. As she watched him ride away across the open prairie, Rebecca felt a strange mix of emotions. She had probably just saved a life, but she had no idea what it might mean for her future. In a land where trust between different peoples was rare and dangerous, she had chosen to act with her heart instead of her fear. She picked up her buckets and finished collecting water from the creek. But her mind was far from her daily routine. Something had changed today, though she couldn't have said exactly what. As she walked back to her cabin, she kept thinking about the boy's eyes, and the way he had looked at her before riding away. Little did she know that this simple act of human kindness would soon change her life in ways she never could have imagined. The walk back to her cabin felt different that morning. Rebecca carried her water buckets, but her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened at the creek. The image of the young boy's face stayed with her, the fear in his eyes when he was trapped. And then the gratitude when she helped him get free. She set the buckets down outside her door and paused for a moment, looking back toward the creek. The boy was long gone now, probably miles away by this time. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if this morning would just become another memory in her collection of frontier experiences inside her small cabin. Rebecca tried to go about her normal routine. She had breakfast to prepare, animals to tend, and a dozen other daily tasks that kept her busy from sunrise to sunset. But every few minutes she found herself stopping whatever she was doing and thinking about the rescue. Had she done the right thing? That question kept bouncing around in her head like a ball in an empty room. Her late husband, Thomas, had always been cautious about interactions with the local tribes. Not hostile, but careful. He used to say that understanding between different peoples took time and trust, and both were hard to come by on the frontier. But looking at that child trapped in the quicksand, Rebecca hadn't thought about politics, or tribal tensions, or any of the warnings her neighbors had given her over the years. She had just seen a young person in danger, and every instinct in her body had told her to help Dot by afternoon. She was trying to focus on mending a tear in one of her dresses. The needle kept slipping in her fingers as her mind wandered. She kept thinking about the way the boy had looked at her before riding away. That gesture where he put his hand over his heart and pointed to her. Even without sharing a language, the meaning had been clear. He was telling her he would remember. The next morning brought new routines, but the same distracted thoughts. Rebecca milked her cow, gathered eggs from her small chicken coop, and tended to her vegetable garden. The tomatoes were coming in well this year, and the corn was getting tall. Normal, everyday frontier life, but as she worked in her garden, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just a sense that the world around her had shifted in some small but important way. On the second day after the rescue, Rebecca noticed her chickens acting strange. They seemed more nervous than usual, clustering together and making anxious sounds whenever she approached their co-op. At first she thought maybe a fox or coyote had been prowling around, but she couldn't find any tracks or other signs of predators that evening. As she was bringing in laundry from the line behind her cabin, she could have sworn she saw movement. In the tree line about 100 yards away, she stopped folding sheets and stared hard at the spot, but whatever she thought, she was gone. Probably just a deer, she told herself, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. The third day brought more strange little incidents. When she went to check on her cow in the small pasture near her cabin, she found fresh horse tracks in the soft dirt near the fence. The tracks were unshod, no metal horseshoes like the ones used by most settlers in the area. Native horses. She realized with a start. Rebecca knelt down and examined the tracks more closely. They looked fresh, maybe from the night before. There were several sets, suggesting more than one horse had been near her property. But there were no signs of damage or disturbance. Nothing had been taken or harmed. The tracks just ... were. That night she found it harder to sleep. Every sound outside seemed louder than usual. The wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the settling sounds of her wooden cabin, all of it seemed to carry some hidden meaning that she couldn't quite grasp. She got up twice to peek out her window, but saw nothing except the familiar shapes of her property under the moonlight. Still, the feeling persisted that she wasn't alone, that eyes were watching her from somewhere in the darkness beyond her fence. On the fourth morning, Rebecca woke up earlier than usual. Something had disturbed her sleep, not a loud noise, but something subtle that had pulled her from her dreams. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the pre-dawn quiet, trying to figure out what had woken her. Finally, she got up and padded to her window in bare feet. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east, that gray time before sunrise when the world exists in shadows and half-light. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of her vision, she caught a glimpse of movement. There, at the top of a small hill about a quarter-mile from her cabin, was the silhouette of a horse and rider. They were perfectly still, like a statue against the brightening sky. Rebecca's heart started beating faster. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but something about the way the rider sat on the horse seemed familiar. She watched for several minutes, but the figure didn't move. Then, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, the horse and rider turned and disappeared over the hill. Rebecca stood at her window for a long time after that, wondering if she had really seen what she thought she had seen. The rest of that day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Rebecca found herself checking the windows frequently, looking for any sign of the mysterious watcher. She tried to stay busy with her usual tasks, but concentration was nearly impossible. As evening approached, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of barricading herself inside her cabin as her instincts suggested, she stepped outside and sat on the small wooden bench Thomas had built beside their front door. If someone was watching her, hiding wasn't going to solve anything. Maybe it was time to stop running from whatever was happening and face it head-on. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Rebecca sat on her bench, hands folded in her lap, and waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but something told her that tomorrow would bring answers to the questions that had been building in her mind for the past 3 days. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she finally went inside, but before closing her door, she took one last look across the prairie. Somewhere out there, she felt certain, someone was making plans that would change her life forever. She had saved a child's life by the creek, acting on pure instinct and human compassion. Now, as she prepared for bed on this fourth night, Rebecca wondered what consequences that single act of kindness might bring to her doorstep. In a land where trust was scarce and misunderstandings could turn deadly, she had chosen to help someone from a different world than her own. Tomorrow, she would discover whether that choice had been wise or dangerous. But tonight, all she could do was wait and hope that the bridge she had built with her compassion would prove strong enough to support whatever was coming next. Rebecca woke up before dawn on the fifth day, her heart pounding from a dream she couldn't quite remember. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were pressing in on her. She had barely slept, tossing and turning as every small sound outside seemed amplified in the darkness. She got dressed quickly and stepped outside, breathing in the cool morning air. The familiar routine of checking on her animals usually helped calm her nerves, but today even that felt different. As she walked toward the chicken coop, she noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There, pressed into the soft dirt near her fence, were more horse tracks. But these weren't like the ones she had found before. These tracks formed a pattern, as if someone had ridden slowly around the entire perimeter of her property during the night. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Someone had been circling her home while she slept. Rebecca knelt down and studied the tracks more carefully. They were definitely unshod horses, and from the depth and spacing she could tell there had been more than one rider. At least 3, maybe 4. They had moved quietly and deliberately, staying just outside her fence line, like they were mapping out every detail of her small homestead. Her chickens were in an absolute frenzy this morning, squawking and flapping their wings whenever she came near. Even Bessie, her usually calm milk cow, seemed jumpy and kept looking toward the tree line with wide, nervous eyes. Animals could sense things that humans often missed, and their behavior was telling her that danger was nearby. As she went about her morning chores, Rebecca found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. She had lived alone on the frontier for 2 years since Thomas died, and she had never felt this vulnerable before. By midday, the heat was becoming unbearable, but Rebecca didn't want to go inside her cabin. Being trapped in those small rooms felt like putting herself in a box with no way out. Instead, she sat on her porch, pretending to mend clothes while actually keeping watch on the surrounding area. That's when she saw him, about 200 yards away. At the edge of a small grove of oak trees, a figure sat motionless on horseback. The rider was partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, but Rebecca could make out enough to see that it was a Native American man. He seemed to be watching her just as she was watching him. For nearly an hour they stayed like that, strange standoff between two people who didn't know each other's intentions. Rebecca's hands shook slightly as she held her sewing, but she forced herself to appear calm. Running or hiding would only show fear, and she had learned that showing fear on the frontier was often more dangerous than standing your ground. Eventually, the rider turned his horse and disappeared into the trees. But Rebecca knew this wasn't over. The watchers were getting bolder, showing themselves in daylight now instead of just leaving tracks in the night. Whatever was building toward a conclusion was happening soon. That evening, as she was drawing water from her well, Rebecca heard something that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of horses, multiple horses, moving through the grass somewhere beyond her fence. She couldn't see them in the gathering darkness, but she could hear the soft thudding of hooves and the occasional snort of an animal. She grabbed her water bucket and hurried toward her cabin, but before she could reach the door, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more frightening than the noise had been. Rebecca stood frozen on her porch, listening to the night sounds of crickets and wind, knowing that somewhere in that darkness, riders were positioned around her home. Sleep was impossible that night. Rebecca sat in her chair by the window, Thomas's old rifle across her lap, watching and waiting. Every few hours she would hear the soft sounds of movement outside, the creak of leather, the quiet whinny of a horse, the whisper of grass being disturbed by careful footsteps. She thought about the boy she had saved at the creek, wondering if her act of kindness had somehow brought this situation upon her. Had she made a terrible mistake? Were these riders here to punish her for interfering in something she didn't understand? Or were they here for some other reason entirely? The sixth day dawned gray and overcast with heavy clouds promising rain. Rebecca felt exhausted from her sleepless night, but she knew she had to stay alert. Something was going to happen today. She could feel it in the air like the electricity before a thunderstorm as she stepped outside to tend to her animals. She immediately noticed something different. The horse tracks around her property were even more numerous now, creating a complex pattern that suggested the riders had been moving back and forth all night. But there was something else, something that made her heart race with a mixture of fear and confusion. Sitting on her fence post, weighted down with a small stone, was a piece of cloth. It was beautifully woven in patterns she had never seen before, with colors that seemed to shimmer even in the gray morning light. Rebecca approached it carefully, looking around for any sign of the person who had left it there. She picked up the cloth and examined it closely. It was soft and expertly made, clearly the work of skilled hands. But what did it mean? Was it a message? A warning? A gift? She had no way to interpret the gesture, but the fact that someone had come close enough to her cabin to leave it there sent shivers down her spine. Throughout that day, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Rebecca tried to go about her normal routine, but it was impossible to concentrate on anything. She found herself making mistakes, spilling milk, dropping eggs, leaving gates open that should have been closed. Her nerves were stretched too. The breaking point that afternoon turned toward evening. She made a decision that would have seemed crazy to her just a week ago. Instead of hiding in her cabin, she was going to confront whatever was happening. She couldn't live like this anymore. Jumping at every shadow and losing sleep over unknown threats, Rebecca walked to the center of her property and stood there, facing the tree line where she had seen the rider that morning. She raised her voice, not shouting but speaking clearly and firmly. "I know you're out there," she called. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not going to hide anymore. If you have something to say to me, then say it. If you mean me harm, then do what you're going to do. But stop playing games." The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment. Then, as if in response to her challenge, she heard the sound of horses moving through the grass. Not trying to be quiet this time, but moving openly. The sound was coming from multiple directions, north, south, east, and west. Rebecca realized with a start that she was surrounded. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she stood her ground. She had made her choice. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences her decision had set in motion, but tonight she would face them with dignity instead of cowering in fear. As darkness fell over the Texas prairie, Rebecca walked back to her cabin, with her head held high. She had no idea what the morning would bring, but she knew that the waiting was almost over. The mysterious watchers were ready to reveal themselves, and she was ready to face whatever that revelation might mean for her future. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Rebecca barely slept that night, but somehow the darkness felt different. Instead of the creeping fear that had kept her awake for the past several days, there was an odd sense of calm. She had made her stand, spoken her challenge into the prairie wind, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for whatever would come with the sunrise. She sat by her window as the first gray light began to creep across the horizon, watching the familiar landscape of her small homestead. Everything looked exactly the same as it had every morning for the past 2 years, but she knew that today would change everything. The feeling was so strong she could almost taste it in the air. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Rebecca went through her morning routine one more time. She fed her chickens, though they were still acting nervous and jumpy. She milked Bessie, who kept turning her head toward the east as if she could see something approaching that Rebecca couldn't yet make out. By the time she finished her chores, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the prairie grass. That's when she saw them. They came from the east, silhouetted against the morning light like figures from a dream. At first, Rebecca could only make out the shapes of horses and riders moving slowly across the open ground. As they got closer, she began to count. 1, 2, 3. Her heart started beating faster. 7, 8, 9. This was more than just a few watchers. 12 riders in total, moving in a loose formation toward her property. Rebecca walked to the front of her cabin and stood on her small porch, her hands at her sides, trying to look calm even though her heart was racing. The riders were close enough now that she could see they were all Native American men, sitting tall and proud on their horses. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had spent their entire lives on horseback. As they approached her fence line, the riders spread out in a wide semicircle, but they didn't cross onto her property. They just stopped there, maybe 30 yards away, and for a long moment nobody moved. The silence stretched out like a taut rope filled with tension. And possibility. Then one of the riders, a man who seemed to be their leader, nudged his horse forward a few steps. He was older than the others, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent under the prairie sun. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the dignity in the way he carried himself, the natural authority that made it clear he was someone important, but it was the rider next to him that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. There, sitting proudly on a small paint horse, was the boy she had pulled from the quicksand at the creek. He looked different now, clean clothes, his hair braided with small feathers, sitting straighter and more confident than when she had first seen him trapped and afraid. But there was no mistaking those dark eyes or the serious expression on his young face. The boy said something in his own language to the older man, pointing toward Rebecca. The man nodded, and then, to Rebecca's complete surprise, he began to dismount from his horse. This simple action seemed significant somehow, a gesture of respect or peaceful intention that made some of the tension in Rebecca's shoulders ease slightly. The man walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. When he reached the edge of her property, he stopped and looked directly at her. His face was weathered and stern, but his eyes held something that looked almost like curiosity, respect. Rebecca couldn't be sure. Then he began to speak, and Rebecca was amazed to realize that his words, though heavily accented, were in English. "You are the woman," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "You are the one who saved the boy." Rebecca found her voice, though. It came out smaller than she had intended. "Yes," she said, "I couldn't just watch him drown." The man nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied him in some way. "I am Chief Running Bear," he said. "This boy is my son." "My youngest son?" The simple words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The child she had saved wasn't just any member of the tribe. He was the chief's son. No wonder there had been so much activity around her property. No wonder they had been watching her so carefully. She had saved the life of someone incredibly important, and she hadn't even known it. Chief Running Bear continued speaking, his English careful but clear. "For 6 days we have watched you. We wanted to know what kind of person you are. We wanted to see if you were someone who could be trusted." Rebecca felt her cheeks flush. "You could have just asked," she said, then immediately regretted the words. This wasn't the time for sass or attitude, but the chief's expression didn't change. If anything, there might have been the slightest hint of amusement in his eyes. "We needed to be sure," he said. "My son told us what you did, how you risked your own safety to save him. But words are one thing, character is another." He gestured toward the other riders, who remained motionless on their horses, watching the conversation with intense interest. "These are my warriors, my advisors, my family." They wanted to know if the white woman who saved our boy was someone worthy of trust and respect. "And?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chief was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if he could read her soul through her eyes. Then he smiled, the first smile she had seen from any of them, and it transformed his entire face from stern to almost grandfatherly. "You did not run when you saw us coming," he said. "You did not hide in your house or point a weapon at. You stood here and waited, even though you were afraid. That tells us much about who you are." The boy, the chief's son, said something in their language, his voice excited and urgent. The chief listened, nodded, and then looked back at Rebecca. "My son wants to thank you properly," he said. "He has been thinking about what you did every day since it happened. He says you have the heart of a mother, even for a child who was Not your own, even for a child whose people are often enemies of your people. Rebecca felt tears starting to form in her eyes. He was just a little boy in trouble, she said. I couldn't have done anything else, but you could have, the chief said quietly. Many would have, many have. You chose differently. He turned and said something to his son, who immediately jumped down from his horse and began walking toward Rebecca. The boy moved with purpose, reaching into a small leather pouch that hung around his neck. When he reached the edge of her porch, he stopped and looked up at her with those same dark eyes that had looked so frightened in the quicksand. The boy held out his hand, and in his palm was a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than Rebecca's thumb. The carving was exquisite, showing every detail of a running horse with its mane flowing in the wind. The wood had been polished until it gleamed like satin. For you, the boy said in careful English, the words clearly practiced, so you remember. Rebecca knelt down and gently took the small horse from his palm. The wood was warm from being carried close to his body, and she could feel the love and skill that had gone into making it. Thank you, she whispered, and the boy smiled, a bright, genuine smile that reminded her that despite everything that had happened, he was still just a child. The chief watched this exchange with approval, then gestured for his son to return to the group. As the boy walked back to his horse, the chief looked at Rebecca one more time. We have gifts for you, he said, to show our gratitude. But more than that, we have something else to offer. Rebecca looked up from the small carved horse in her hands, wondering what else this incredible morning could possibly bring. Chief Running Bear gestured to his warriors, and Rebecca watched in amazement as they began to dismount from their horses. Each man moved with purpose, walking to packs and bundles that had been tied to their saddles. She had been so focused on the riders themselves that she hadn't noticed how much they were carrying with them. You saved my son's life, the chief said, his voice filled with emotion that he hadn't shown before. In our culture, this creates a debt that must be honored. But more than that, it shows us who you truly are inside. The first warrior approached, carrying what looked like a beautifully woven blanket. The colors were unlike anything Rebecca had ever seen, deep blues and rich reds that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. The patterns were intricate, telling stories she couldn't understand but could somehow feel were important. This was made by my wife, the chief explained as the warrior laid the blanket gently on her porch. She worked on it through the long winter months. When our son told her about the white woman who saved him, she insisted that you should have it. Rebecca knelt down and touched the blanket with trembling fingers. The wool was softer than anything she had ever felt, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every thread had been placed with care and purpose. It's beautiful, she whispered. I don't know what to say. Say nothing, the chief replied. Just accept it with the spirit in which it is given. The second warrior came forward carrying strips of dried meat wrapped in another piece of cloth. Buffalo, the chief explained, prepared the way our people have done for generations. It will keep for many months and will sustain you through difficult times. Another warrior brought pottery, bowls, and a water jug decorated with the same intricate patterns as the blanket. The clay had been fired to a beautiful reddish-brown color and polished until it gleamed. Rebecca had never owned anything so fine, but it was the fourth warrior who brought something that truly took her breath away. He carried a necklace made of silver and turquoise, with stones that caught the light like pieces of the sky itself. The metalwork was delicate and complex, clearly the product of a master craftsman. This belonged to my grandmother, the chief said, as the warrior placed it carefully in Rebecca's hands. She was known for her wisdom and her kindness to all people, regardless of what tribe they came from. My son believes you have her spirit. Rebecca held the necklace up to the light, watching the turquoise stones sparkle. The weight of it in her hands felt significant, like she was holding something much more valuable than jewelry. She was holding a piece of family history, a symbol of acceptance and respect. I can't take this, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's too precious. Chief Running Bear shook his head firmly. It belongs with someone who understands its meaning. My grandmother would have wanted it this way. As the warriors continued to bring gifts, more blankets, tools, beadwork, and carved items, Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the generosity. But she could sense that something even more important was coming. The chief had mentioned something else to offer, and she could see in his eyes that the gifts, wonderful as they were not the real reason for this visit. When the last of the gifts had been placed on her porch, Chief Running Bear raised his hand and all the warriors stepped back. The chief himself moved closer to Rebecca, his expression becoming even more serious than before. "These gifts show our gratitude," he said. "But there is something more important we want to give you. Something that cannot be touched or held, but is more valuable than all the blankets and silver in the world." Rebecca waited, her heart pounding with anticipation. The chief swept his arm in a wide gesture that encompassed all the land around her homestead. "This territory belongs to my people," he said. "We have lived here, hunted here, raised our children here for more generations than can be counted. Other white settlers who come here are seen as invaders, as threats to our way of life." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Was this where the kindness ended? Was he about to tell her she had to leave? But the chief's next words surprised her completely. "You are different," he said. "You have shown that not all white people see us as enemies. You risked your life to save one of our children, asking for nothing in return. Because of this, we offer you something no other settler in this territory has ever been given." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the morning air. "Our protection," he said finally. "From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Comanche nation. No member of our tribe will harm you or your property. Any other tribes that respect our authority will know that you are not to be touched. You will live here in peace, as long as you wish to stay." The words hit Rebecca like a physical force. Protection from the Comanche was something that no settler could buy, bargain for, or demand. It was a gift beyond price, something that would change the entire nature of her life on the frontier. "But how will others know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chief smiled and pointed to a wooden post near her cabin. One of the warriors was already working on it, carving symbols into the wood with a sharp knife. "This mark will tell all who see it that this place is under our protection, and we will make sure that word spreads to the other tribes in the area." Rebecca watched the warrior work, each cut of his knife deliberate and meaningful. The symbol he was carving looked like a horse with a human figure beside it, the story of her rescue of the chief's son. She realized being written in a language that would be understood by anyone who needed to understand it. "There is one more thing," the chief said, and Rebecca turned her attention back to him. "My son wishes to visit you sometimes, if you would welcome such visits. You gave him back his life, and he feels a connection to you that he cannot explain. He wants to learn some of your language, and perhaps you might learn some of ours." Rebecca looked over at the boy, who was watching her with hopeful eyes. The idea of having visitors, of not being completely alone on the frontier anymore, was more appealing than she could have imagined just a week ago. "I would like that very much," she said, and the boy's face lit up with joy. Chief Running Bear nodded with satisfaction. "Then it is settled. You saved one of our children, and now you are part of our extended family. This is the way things should be between people who share the same land." As the warriors began to mount their horses again, preparing to leave, the chief took one last look around Rebecca's homestead. "You have made a good life here," he said. "Now you can live it without fear." Rebecca stood on her porch, surrounded by beautiful gifts, watching as the group of riders prepared to depart. The boy, the chief's son whose name she still didn't know, waved to her from his horse, and she waved back, clutching the small carved horse he had given her. "Wait," she called out suddenly. "I don't even know your son's name." The chief smiled. "His name is Swift Fox," he said. "And he has asked what your name is." "Rebecca," she said. "My name is Rebecca." The chief repeated the name carefully, then said something to his son in their own language. The boy nodded eagerly and called out, "Thank you, Rebecca," in his accented English. As the riders moved away across the prairie, heading back toward their own territory, Rebecca remained on her porch for a long time. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and she could feel its warmth on her face. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago, but everything was different too. She picked up the beautiful turquoise necklace and fastened it around her neck. The weight of it felt comfortable, like it belonged there. Then she gathered up the other gifts, taking them inside her cabin where they would be safe and treasured. Later that day, as she was working in her garden, Rebecca heard the sound of a horse approaching. For just a moment, her old fears started to surface, but then she remembered the carved symbol on her fence post and the promise of protection it represented. The visitor turned out to be her nearest neighbor, a farmer named Johnson who lived about 5 miles away. He stopped his horse at her fence and stared in amazement at the Comanche symbol carved into her post. "Rebecca," he said, his voice filled with awe, "do you know what this means?" Rebecca smiled and touched the turquoise necklace at her throat. "Yes," she said, "it means I'm home." From that day forward, Rebecca's life on the frontier was transformed. She lived without the constant fear that had plagued so many settlers. Swift Fox visited her regularly, and she began to learn some of the Comanche language while teaching him more English. Other members of the tribe would sometimes stop by, always friendly, sometimes bringing small gifts or simply checking to make sure she was well. The story of the white woman who saved a Comanche child and was adopted into their protection spread throughout the territory. Some settlers criticized her for her friendship with the tribe, but Rebecca didn't care. She had learned that courage and kindness could build bridges between even the most different of peoples, and every night, as she prepared for bed in her small cabin, Rebecca would hold the carved wooden horse that Swift Fox had given her. It reminded her of the moment when she chose compassion over fear, and how that single choice had changed not just one life, but many lives in ways she never could have imagined.